Feeling nostalgic for Venn diagrams? If so, you're in luck, because we're going to play around with them some more in this thought primer. Hey, recall from our earlier conversation about the concept existential import. And what we established is that when we're operating from the Boolean standpoint and encounter an argument that has this form, a universal premise that's being offered as true and a particular conclusion offered as true, that argument is always invalid from the Boolean standpoint. It commits the existential fallacy. It doesn't matter what the argument is about, that form of argument is never acceptable from the Boolean standpoint. However, it might be acceptable from the Aristotelian standpoint. The Aristotelian standpoint will accept an argument with a universal premise and a particular conclusion, and it considers that form of argument to be conditionally valid. Okay, so it's conditionally valid, and the condition that has to be met for it to be valid is that the subject term has to refer to something that actually exists. If the subject term doesn't actually exist, then that argument commits the existential fallacy from the Aristotelian standpoint as well. Now consider all of this in light of an argument that we looked at last time. All students watching this lecture are people with interesting life stories. Therefore, some students watching this lecture are people with interesting life stories. Now, we look at this argument, we can see it has this form. It has the universal A statement premise and the particular I statement conclusion. So we know that this argument is invalid from the Boolean standpoint because it commits the existential fallacy. And we know that by subalternation, it's conditionally valid from the Aristotelian standpoint. The condition that has to be met is that students watching this lecture has to exist as a thing. And you do. So this argument it's met the condition for validity from the Aristotelian standpoint. Now I want you to think about this argument and look to see what happens to it when we create a Venn diagram for it. So remember, when we create Venn diagrams, we mark only the premise, never the conclusion. Because what we're trying to see is that if we mark the Venn diagram showing the premise statement as true, does the Venn diagram then reflect the conclusion statement as well? And if it does, then that proves that the argument is valid. It proves that the conclusion has to be true and the premise is true. But if we mark the premise statement in a Venn diagram, and the conclusion statement is not reflected in that Venn diagram after doing so, then we know that that argument is invalid because it's possible for the conclusion to be false because it doesn't show up in the Venn diagram. Now let's go ahead and break this argument down into symbols. We'll say all S are P, therefore some S are P, and we'll create our Venn diagram. And when we create our Venn diagram for the A statement premise, we shade out area 1 because that's the area where there would be students that would not be people with interesting life stories, because everything that's a person with an interesting life story is in this blue circle here. Now, I notice this Venn diagram shows the premise statement, but it doesn't show the conclusion, right? The conclusion says some S or P. And if this Venn diagram showed some S or P, we'd see an X right there in area 2, because that would be showing us there's at least one S that's a P. But we don't get that X after marking just the premise. So what's going on here? That's what we're going to explore in this thought primer.